The Brothers Karamazov, Book 6, Chapter 3. In Book 6, Chapter 2, the previous chapter, Father Zosima began his last words before dying. And in his last words in the previous chapter, he covered 4 sections of his life. First, his childhood, and as his early childhood pertained to his brothers. Second, his early childhood as it pertained to being taught the Holy Scriptures. Third, he moves from his early childhood to his late teen, early, maybe mid-20s era, and he talked chiefly about a dual and a sort of religious conversion, or maybe a religious reconversion, or a religious awakening the night before the duel, and how that played out in the duel the next day. And then fourthly, a more recent example of a mysterious visitor at night who came to confess to him. He covers 5 more sections before he passes on at the end of this chapter and of this book. And those sections, first he talks about the monks. Second, about the relationship between slaves and masters. Third, he talks about prayer and the interconnectedness of prayer. Fourth, he talks about judging. And then finally, he talks about hell. So first of all, Dostoevsky, in the words of Zosima, defends the office of monks. And so the chapter begins with Zosima's sort of 5th main point as his last words, and he's going to defend the office of monks, and he's going to do more than just defend the office of monks. He's going to say something prophetic. So he acknowledges that there are, of course, bad monks, that there are monks who use the office, who leverage the office for all sorts of material gain, for laziness. There are hypocrites in religious positions, of course, always. There's always charlatans, always pretenders, taking on the role of godliness when they in character are the opposite. But he says that is not all of the monks. Instead, those are just the ones we hear about. The very nature of the life of a monk is to be humble and quiet about it. And so there's many more monks that are respectable, and the majority of monks fit that mold. And then he goes on to say, okay, so there's those 2 kinds of monks, but then he's going to say a lot more. He's going to venture out a lot more. And Dostoevsky, through Zosima, says that monks will in fact be the salvation of Russia. And so they are the ones who will bear the image of Christ, and the people will be led by the monks, and the people will also, in another way, require of the monks that they continue to bear the image of Christ, and through the people, Russia will be saved. And in these sections, Dostoevsky seems to come very, very close to some sort of collapsing, or maybe joining together a little bit too close for my comfort, the salvation of Russia with some sort of eschatological salvation, or the salvation of Russia with the work of Christ. In other words, his end time scenario seems very Russia-centric, very monk-centric. But anyway, Zosima has a very high view of the monks. So then, after he's first contrasts the 2 types of monks, the bad ones and the good ones, and then given a prophecy, what will come of the good ones? Well, they will be the salvation of Russia. He's going to contrast that salvation with the other theory of the salvation of Russia, and that's, again, the theme of the entire novel. Will reason save Russia in the world, or will faith save Russia in the world? And he's going to, of course, argue through Zosima that faith has a distinct advantage that reason does not have. Look at the worldly and all who set themselves up above the people of God. Has not God's image and his truth been distorted in them? They have science, but in science there is nothing but what is the object of sense. The spiritual world, the higher part of man's being, is rejected altogether, dismissed with a sort of triumph, even with hatred. The world has proclaimed the reign of freedom, especially of late. But what do we see in this freedom of theirs? Nothing but slavery and self-destruction, for the world says, you have desires and so satisfy them, for you have the same rights as the most rich and powerful. Don't be afraid of satisfying them and even multiplying your desires. That is the modern doctrine of the world, in that they see freedom. And what follows from this right of multiplication of desires? In the rich, isolation and spiritual suicide. In the poor, envy and murder. For they have been given rights, but have not been shown the means of satisfying their wants. A little bit later, instead of gaining freedom, they have sunk into slavery, and instead of serving the cause of brotherly love and the union of humanity, have fallen, on the contrary, into separation and isolation, as my mysterious visitor and teacher said to me in my youth. So again, Zosima is arguing, as we saw hinted at way back in Book 2 and the discussion in his cell about Ivan in his article about the relationship between church and state, and Ivan arguing, I think ironically, paradoxically, surprisingly, the same thing that Zosima is arguing here, that the only basis of human rights, the only basis of truth and righteousness and justice, of believing in any sort of love of humankind, has to come from a Christian worldview. You can't get there. You can't get through science alone. Science will never provide a rational basis for justice, for believing that life has value. He says that science can only tell you what you can apprehend with the senses. It is never a basis for justice. And so, yes, there are bad monks, but there are good monks too. And these good monks will be the salvation of Russia. Why? Because through atheistic socialism, there can never be salvation. Why? Because there's no rational basis for love. There's no rational basis for justice. All there is in an atheistic worldview, according to Zosima, is the desire more and more for pleasure, and he said what that leads to is an isolation and despair. Why isolation? Because in the pursuit of pleasure, we are turned inwards. The pursuit of physical pleasure is, in Zosima's categories, the opposite of active love. Active love is selfless, going out into the world and into the lives of others to seek their good. And the pursuit of pleasure, which is the logical extension of atheistic socialism per Zosima, that can only be turned inward and inward for the pursuit of pleasure, and that will lead to isolation because your pursuits are selfish. And that's not the only negative outcome of the pursuit of pleasure. Not only you're cut off and isolated from all your fellow humans in your pursuit of material, physical pleasure, but also it just simply doesn't work. By our very nature, our pursuit of pleasure is constituted as insatiable. So there is never a level of pleasure that is good enough. We just simply get used to it. We readjust and we find a level, and then our desires are kindled anew. So there's never a level of pleasure. There's never enough that will satisfy us. There is an infantile part of us that is insatiable and wants and wants and wants more. And so therefore, the monks have the only key to see past this. It is actually, and surprisingly, and ironically, and paradoxically, the monks who practice self-denial and fasting and caring about other people, that is actually the thing that is going to, in the very long run, be the true salvation and the pleasure of the world. So you would think that satisfying yourself immediately leads to ultimate satisfaction, but actually self-denial and others-centered love is the key and the monks are the ones who will show the way toward that. Next section, he talks about the relationship between slaves and masters, and it's sort of a variation on a theme here. It's the main theme of the novel, again, which is the salvation of Russia and humankind. Is it reason or faith? And so he looks at now that theme through the lens of the relationship between slaves and masters, of serfs and aristocracy, and he says that masters should not only free slaves but look at them with a dignity. And he says only the concept of the image of God, only seeing the image of Christ in people, will lead to equality. Only seeing other human beings as having a dignity and a destiny is the only rational basis for true equality in a society. And so he gives a personal anecdote from again this servant that was a major part of the story in the third section of the previous chapter, the one he insulted the night before his duel that led to his religious awakening. Well, he met up with that servant much later in life, and they found out that their roles had been reversed, and now Zosima was asking him for things, and Zosima is telling this as a perfect picture of sort of a Christian ideal where everything is upside down, and the slave has become master and the master has become slave, and basically all gender and race and all types of people are completely flattened out because we're all the same, equal in every way. And that the whole baseline of that, the whole reason for that, the whole ability to reason that way is that we are all the image of Christ. And so there is a basic dignity of every type of person. So when you see a person, you don't see them by their race, ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic status, but rather the only question is, are they human? Then they are the image of God. And if they bear the image of Christ, then there is a basic goodness to them. And so only the Christian belief in the basic goodness of the basic worth of a human will lead to human rights. And so that's Zosima's sort of political take on the relationship between slaves and masters. Socialism will never get you there. Believing that people are biological accidents will never get you to human rights and to social justice. Next, Zosima talks about the importance of prayer, and it's interesting that he speaks very little about the personal benefit of prayer. Rather, he talks about the benefit that your prayer is to other people. And even when he talks about the benefit that prayer is to the prayer, the benefit is that you start to see the world not only for your own circumstances and praying for your own comfort and security, but rather as you pray, your eyes are taken off of yourself. You are no longer a navel gazer, because when you're a navel gazer, you end up being no help to anyone. If you spend all your life thinking about yourself and philosophy and reflection, and you never take that reflection and deep thought about life, and if that never moves you out into the world to do some good, then it was all for nothing. And so for Zosima, prayer is that thing that sets our minds on the right course. And so as you pray for other people, you not only help them, but you help yourself have a less self-centered perspective and an others-centered perspective, and that is important for prayer. Then he asks, in the second to last section, he asks if there is any basis for judgment of another person. And, he says yes, but only before only after we have first judged ourselves. And so the only way that humans are equipped to judge other humans is first if we admit that we are just as guilty as they are. And then, and only then, are we able to call something evil in another person. Similar to Jesus' teaching on the Sermon on the Mount, a lot of people like to lift out the one verse where Jesus says, "Judge not, lest ye be judged." But in the broader context, Jesus is saying, first remove the telephone-sized obstruction in your own eye to see the speck of dust. And remember, Jesus was a carpenter, so he had probably had little specks of dust fly up into his eyes for 30 years. And he says, remove the giant obstacle out of your eye so that you can see the tiny speck of dust in another eye. And so, of course, that's a picturesque way of saying what I think Zosima is repeating here. First acknowledge your own connectedness to other people's fallenness and your own propensity that if the situations were the same, that you are just as prone to all the sins that anyone would commit. And so, yes, judge, but only after you have acknowledged your connection with other people's sins. Now, this is just sort of basic, historic, Orthodox Christian teaching, and of course it is a counter to Ivan's questions of justice in the previous book, but it is also important going forward for Ivan's crisis, that you remember that Zosima teaches this core Orthodox Christian principle of connectedness and morality. And so a main issue as we sort of prosecute the case that what is the salvation of Russia and the world, reason or faith, reason is going to say that no one is responsible for anyone else's crime but the criminal. And faith is going to say we're all responsible for all crimes. And Zosima is even going to admit in his last words here in this section, in this chapter, he's going to admit that this sounds insane, that this can't really be sustained logically, yet it is the only way that works in the world. It's the only way that justice and humility are going to work, according to Zosima. Zosima's final teaching has to do with hell and how he takes hell, and he doesn't leave us in suspense for very long. He says in the very opening line that hell is actually the inability to love. And so don't really care very much, but I just want to point out that this was a tough pill to swallow. Really, all of Book 6 was a tough pill to swallow for some members of the Russian Orthodox Church at the time. They looked at Dostoevsky's portrayal of the monks. They liked some of his portrayal. They were offended by his portrayal of Father Ferapont and his mysticism. And then when they see Father Zosima denying any sort of a literal hellfire, literal existence of hell, but rather making it sort of a psychological state, the inability to love, that was out of step with historic Eastern Orthodox doctrine, as I understand it. And Orthodox doctrine has the most latitude of any Christian tradition that at least that I know of. There's a wide variety of things that you can believe about the eternal state in the Orthodox Church. But even given that, Dostoevsky's views expressed through Zosima here seem to be outside the bounds. It's sort of common in the 21st century to sort of psychologize hell and describe it in terms like these. But he's taking a major right turn from someone like Dante and really psychologizing the concept of hell, describing it as the inability to love. And then the thing that we've been waiting books and books for, remember how weak Zosima was even back in Book 2. As he's talking to those ladies and debating with Ivan and watching the argument unfold between Dmitri and Fyodor, he was weak all the way back a few days ago in Book 2. And so now, finally, Zosima dies. And as he dies, he does so in a posture, in a position that is not surprising. He dies peacefully, serenely, calmly, and he hugs the earth. And so that's, again, reminiscent of all these grand gestures we've seen so far in the book. The first one, when he bowed down to Dmitri. The other, as Christ kisses the Grand Inquisitor. And then upon hearing the story of the Grand Inquisitor, Alyosha bows and kisses Ivan, and so on and so on. And so now here Zosima bows down and gives the earth a hug as his last act as a being on this earth. And so that's the exit. Now Zosima is off the stage, but the stage is now set for the real action of the novel to really pick up, because all of the history of the characters, the character of the characters, and chiefly the philosophy of the characters is all now in place. And now as the story unfolds, now we'll see how does a life of reason play out in the action of life, and how does a life of faith play out in the action of life. So the stage is really set for a lot more to happen throughout the close of these last 5 books of the book.